Imagine your flat just lost £100,000 in value. Not because you did anything wrong, not because the market crashed, because the people who built your building used the wrong cladding, nobody's fixed it in 5 years, and now you can't sell, you can't move, and you're watching six figures evaporate while you wait. That's not a hypothetical. That's exactly what's happening right now to leaseholders at a development called Drayton Park in London, where a 5 year delay in removing unsafe cladding has wiped £100,000 off the value of their flats. They can't sell. Many have had to put their life plans on hold, and on top of the falling value, they're facing a sixfold rise in insurance premiums and soaring mortgage and service costs. And here's the part that should worry you even if you've never heard of Drayton Park. This isn't a one-off. This is happening across England right now, and the reason it can happen to you depends on a single technical label most leaseholders have never even heard of until the bill arrives. So what's actually going on? It's not one thing, it's three things stacked on top of each other. First, a building safety crisis that's nearly 9 years old and still not fixed. Second, a legal loophole that decides, almost arbitrarily, who gets protected from the cost and who doesn't. And third, a scale problem so large that hundreds of thousands of ordinary leaseholders are sitting on bills they can't pay and can't escape. Once you understand all three, you'll understand exactly why your own flat, or your parents, or your friends could be next. Let's start with the mechanism because this is the part almost nobody explains properly. After the Grenfell Tower fire, the government brought in the Building Safety Act 2022, and the headline promise was simple. Leaseholders should not have to pay to fix dangerous cladding that someone else installed. For a lot of people, that promise holds. If you're what's called a qualifying leaseholder, meaning your flat was your only or main home, or you owned no more than 3 UK properties total, as of February 2022, you're protected. The building owner has to pay, you don't. But here's the twist almost nobody sees coming until the bill lands on their doormat. If you fall outside that narrow definition, even slightly, you become what's called a non-qualifying leaseholder. And non-qualifying leaseholders get none of those protections. Own a fourth flat you rent out? Non-qualifying. Bought through certain ownership structures? Non-qualifying. The campaign group END. Our cladding scandal estimates there are 385,000 flats in England owned by leaseholders who fall into exactly this gap. 385,000. That's not a rounding error in a government spreadsheet. That's hundreds of thousands of real people who thought the Building Safety Act protected them and don't actually qualify. To understand why this gap even exists, you have to go back to where this whole crisis started. In June 2017, the Grenfell Tower fire killed 72 people, and the official investigation found that flammable cladding on the outside of the building was a major reason the fire spread as fast and as fatally as it did. In the years that followed, it became clear Grenfell wasn't an isolated case. The same combustible materials and the same corner-cutting decisions that allowed them to be used had gone up on buildings right across the country during a construction boom that prioritized speed and cost over fire safety. Surveyors started checking buildings that had never been checked properly before, and what they found was a nationwide problem hiding behind ordinary-looking blocks of flats. The Building Safety Act 2022 was the government's answer almost 5 years later, and on paper, it's a real piece of legislation with real teeth. It says no leaseholder living in their own home in a building over 11 meters tall should pay a penny to remove dangerous cladding. That's the promise that gets repeated in every government press release on this topic. The problem is the small print. The protection only applies if you tick specific boxes, and those boxes were drawn up by people in Westminster, not by anyone thinking through every real-world ownership situation a leaseholder might be in. Inherited a second flat from a parent? You might tip over the 3-property limit, bought through a limited company structure, which plenty of ordinary landlords do for entirely legitimate tax reasons. You might not qualify. None of that makes you a property tycoon. It just makes you, on paper, exactly the kind of leaseholder this law was never designed to protect, even though you're carrying exactly the same risk as your protected neighbor 2 doors down. Real quick, if you're finding this useful, go ahead and subscribe. We break down what's actually happening in the UK property market every week with real numbers, no hype. Now back to it. Let's put real numbers on what this actually costs people because the data here is genuinely shocking. According to research covered by LBC, 62.5% of affected leaseholders say fixing their building will cost more than £30,000 per flat. Not the whole building, per flat. And 15.4% of affected leaseholders are facing bills over £100,000. That's not a typo, and it's not an outlier case. That's more than 1 in 7 affected leaseholders staring down a six-figure bill for a problem they didn't cause and can't avoid. The human toll of that number is exactly what you'd expect. More than 1 in 6 affected leaseholders are exploring bankruptcy as a way out. Bankruptcy. Not considering moving. Not frustrated with the process. Bankruptcy. And remember, this is happening on top of a wider crisis that's already squeezing flat owners across the country. According to Hamptons, the share of flats in England and Wales with a service charge exceeding 1% of the property's value has climbed to 37%, up from 29% just 6 years ago. Some lenders have started tightening their criteria specifically to exclude flats with charges that high, which means those flats are becoming harder to mortgage, harder to sell, and in the worst cases, effectively unmortgageable. Flats with a service charge at or below that 1% threshold were 50% more likely to find a buyer. So even before you get anywhere near a six-figure cladding bill, simply owning a flat with a high service charge is already working against you in this market. Now here's where the villain stacking really kicks in, because the financial damage isn't limited to the remediation bill itself. Buildings with known cladding problems don't just become harder to mortgage, they become drastically more expensive to insure. At Drayton Park, the leaseholders aren't just watching their flats lose £100,000 in value while they wait for repairs that haven't started in 5 years. They're also absorbing a sixfold increase in their insurance premiums on top of soaring mortgage and service costs, simply because the building is sitting on an unresolved risk that insurers price in immediately, long before any remediation work actually happens. That's money leaving people's pockets every single month on a property they can't sell and a problem they didn't create for years before a single piece of cladding comes down. And it's not just the financial damage. It's not just that non-qualifying leaseholders have to pay. It's that even when someone else is legally supposed to pay, the system can simply fail to make them. Look at what's happening in Hackney right now. 17 leaseholders there are unable to sell their flats because of an £850,000 developer debt that the council failed to collect for 8 years. 8 years. One owner's sale collapsed entirely when the buyer's mortgage application fell through because of that unresolved debt hanging over the building. These aren't leaseholders who did anything wrong. They're not even non-qualifying. They're qualifying leaseholders who should be protected, and they're still trapped because the body responsible for collecting the money simply didn't do its job for nearly a decade. That's the twist that should genuinely worry you if you own a flat anywhere in England right now. You can do everything right. You can be a qualifying leaseholder under the Building Safety Act. You can have legal protections on paper. And you can still end up unable to sell your home because of bureaucratic failure that has nothing to do with you and that you have no power to fix. One of the 17 Hackney owners had a buyer lined up, a real sale ready to go, and watched it collapse at the final hurdle because the buyer's mortgage lender took one look at the unresolved £850,000 debt sitting over the building and refused to lend against it. That's not a leaseholder losing a sale because the market turned or because they priced their flat wrong. That's a sale lost because a council failed to do its job for 8 straight years, and the bill for that failure landed on people who had nothing to do with creating it. So who is this actually happening to? Let's go back to a real case that shows exactly how this plays out for an ordinary family. Not a property investor, not someone who bought 10 flats to flip. A couple in Salford, owning flats with unsafe cladding, found themselves classed as non-qualifying leaseholders simply because of the structure of their ownership. The kind of detail that sounds technical right up until it determines whether you owe tens of thousands of pounds. They were told that despite the government funding the removal of the cladding itself, they would still have to contribute toward the wider remediation costs. Their plans, their savings, the next decade of their financial life suddenly reorganized around a bill they never expected and could never have budgeted for. That's the human reality sitting underneath every one of those national statistics. Behind the 385,000 figure, behind the 15.4% facing six-figure bills, there are real households doing the maths late at night and not liking the answer. And it's worth being clear about why this keeps happening at the speed it does. The Building Safety Act came in nearly 4 years ago. The Drayton Park leaseholders have already waited 5 years for remediation that still hasn't started. And our cladding scandal has described the pace of the government's response as glacial at best, and has been pushing ministers directly to fix the gaps in protection that leave qualifying and non-qualifying leaseholders alike stuck in properties they can't sell and can't afford to fix. There is movement. A court of appeal ruling has confirmed that building owners and developers cannot pass historical remediation costs on to leaseholders for defects identified before the Building Safety Act came into force, which is a genuine win for some people caught in the system. But a court ruling about historical liability doesn't help a non-qualifying leaseholder who simply falls outside the protected categories entirely. The law can be technically working and still leave hundreds of thousands of people exposed. So here's the full picture. Nearly 9 years after Grenfell, the UK still hasn't built a system that protects everyone caught up in the building safety crisis. It protects some leaseholders almost completely. It leaves others, through no fault of their own, exposed to bills that can run into six figures. And even the leaseholders who are supposed to be protected can end up trapped anyway when the body responsible for enforcing that protection simply doesn't do its job. 385,000 flats. 15% of affected leaseholders facing bills over £100,000. More than 1 in 6 exploring bankruptcy. Those aren't abstract numbers. Those are people who bought a home, did nothing wrong, and ended up trapped by a system that was supposed to protect them. This isn't just a London story, and it isn't just a Salford story either. It's playing out in Manchester, in Leeds, in cities across England, wherever cladding went up, before anyone was checking it properly. If you own a leasehold flat anywhere in England right now, the single most useful thing you can do is find out precisely whether you're a qualifying or non-qualifying leaseholder under the Building Safety Act, and don't assume the answer based on how the building looks or how long you've lived there. The criteria are narrower than most people think, and the only way to know for certain is to check your specific situation, ideally with proper legal advice, before a bill arrives and the decision is made for you. The government says the legislation is under review. And our cladding scandal says the pace of change has been too slow for too long. Both of those things can be true at the same time, and right now that's exactly where hundreds of thousands of leaseholders are sitting, waiting on a system that everyone agrees needs to move faster, while their flats keep losing value and their bills keep arriving. Nobody knows exactly when or if that changes. If you found this useful, subscribe to the Property Signal. We cover what's actually happening in UK property every week with real numbers and no hype. And if you're dealing with this yourself right now, drop a comment. We'd genuinely like to know what you're seeing on the ground.